Hello, friends. Just sitting here in the man cave, contemplating. So I'm going to share it with you. There are two idioms that have been brought down through history. It started out by saying that God is in the details. And that idiom simply meant that it's important to watch for the small details, because those small details, if noticed and practiced, would bring success. Throughout time, history tells us that the idiom went from God is in the details to the devil is in the details. And of course, that idiom simply meant if you overlook the fine details, you're going to find yourself in trouble. So, I'm just going to, from the idiom, the devil is in the details, I'm going to share a personal experience. And this will all tie into other voices. And you're going to see how the devil is in the details with this story. It's a true story. I'm going to start with saying that 2 months before I was born, my biological father was killed in a car crash. Therefore, I never had a chance to meet him, to know him. About 2 months later, after the car crash, I was born. I came into this world. Fast forward. My mother and I lived with her parents, my grandparents, in a small town in Michigan. Excuse me. At the age of 5.5 years old, my mother met this preacher. My mother, my grandparents went to this little Pentecostal church in this little town. This preacher was holding a revival. I guess there was a very rapid attraction there between my mother and this Pentecostal preacher. Of course, my mother was a widow. The preacher had never been married. So I think it was about a 2 or 3 month whirlwind romance. They got married. I can still remember the day. June 11th. Yep, June 11th, 1961. I was getting close to 5.5 years old. So, again, fast forward. Of course, he was an evangelist. We stayed in that small town just for a short period of time because I remember they rented an apartment. Then all of a sudden, it was time for him to start evangelizing. So we went all down through the southern states, a lot of places. Now, there's a lot of details to this story, but I want to focus on one point in this video. Now, again, fast forward. After he became a pastor, about 2 years later, and then as I grew up under him, I would often hear him tell the story to the congregation about how that when he married my mother, they traveled down through the southern states evangelizing, and they went amongst poor people. I remember his stories very clearly. He would talk about how that when an offering was taken, there might be $1, $2, 50 cents. Now you got to remember, this is back in the early 60s. And many people in the southern states were very poor. The churches were poor. So he would relate these stories. Yeah, we live by faith. We lived by faith. Because he loved to preach about faith and healing. Of course, that was the theme during those early years, coming off of the healing revivals in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. That was the main emphasis. Faith and healing. So he would love to tell his stories of how him and my mother lived by faith. Sometimes there was only 50 cents in the offering plate. Sometimes $1, $1.50, $2, $2.50. But God saw us through, and we lived by faith. I heard those stories growing up. Fast forward. Stay with me. I appreciate it. Shortly before my grandmother passed away, she was in her mid-70s. She had heart problems. She refused to go to the doctor. The doctor told her some things that could help her, that would prolong her life, but being from the old Pentecostal school, she said, nope, I'm going to trust God. If it's time for me to go, I'm going to go. Well, she did. But before she passed away, my grandfather had already died, and she was still living in the double-wide trailer in a little village in Ohio, because they had moved from Michigan years before and moved to Ohio. So she called me out to the trailer one day. She wanted to talk to me. This would have been somewhere in the mid-'80s, maybe. No. I'm sorry. This would have been in the early to mid-'90s. Yeah, I'm sorry. So I go out there and I said, yeah, Granny, what's on your mind? She said, well, sit down. I want to talk to you about a few things. I said, okay. She said, I want to ask you a question. I said, okay, what is it? She said, did you ever know anything about your trust fund? I said, no, I didn't know anything about it. She said, well, when your dad passed away in that car crash, of course, he was a veteran. And she said, from the time you were born until you were 18 years old, you received 2 checks a month, one from his veterans and his Social Security. And that was to continue till you were 18 years old. And if you had decided to go to college, it would have continued till you were 22. I said, I didn't know anything about that. She said, well, you need to talk to your mother about that. I said, okay. Fast forward. So I made arrangements to meet the stepdad and my mother at the stepdad's church office, which was a very nice little office on the side of the church itself. He had it fixed up real nice, things that he'd collected on vacation from different states, and just had it very nice. Had a nice wood-burning, like a wood-burning airtight stove or something like that. Nice lamps and pictures and stuff on the walls, he had collected. So I met him there at the office. So as usual, he sat behind his desk and my mother sat on the couch. And I said, well, I have to ask, I looked at my mother and I said, I have to ask a question. And I said, whatever happened to my trust fund from my biological father, my real father? Well, she looked at me, and of course you'd have to know my mother. She looked at me and said, what are you talking about? I said, I'm just asking a question. And I asked it just like this. I said, whatever happened to my trust fund from my father? She said, who told you that? I said, well, it doesn't really matter who told me. Is it true or not? Did I have a trust fund or didn't I have a trust fund? She come off the couch. I'm sitting in a chair. She jumped off the couch and started screaming at me and asking, "Who told you that? Who told you that?" And my mother could be very, very emotional. Uh, I said, "It doesn't matter who told me. Just simply answer the question. Is it true or not?" Of course, by this time, I knew it had to be true. She was just, she was beside herself, screaming and yelling. "Who told you? Who told you?" So finally, I just looked at her and I said, "Granny did, your mother." Now remember what we're talking about. We're talking about the devil in the details. So now we're going to focus on the devil in the details. She said, "Well, we used that money to raise you." I said, "Oh, really? Raise me?" I said, "No, that was supposed to be put in a trust fund." "Now we use that money to raise you." I said, "Well, that don't even make sense to me. You set up a trust fund, and that's for me to have when I turn 18 or 22. So I said, "Well, then that leads me to another question." Now we're getting to the devil in the details here. I said, "I ran away from home at 15, went to live with Granny and Grandpa in Michigan at that time, and never did come back home." Well, I did when I came back from Michigan to Ohio after my grandparents moved from Michigan to Ohio. I tried to stay with them. I think it lasted a day or two. I don't know. It didn't work out. So I went and stayed with two friends of mine because I'm about 18 years old now. So I should have just went back and stayed with my grandparents. But anyway, I said, I left home. I ran home at 15. I'm 18. So where is all that money for those 3 years? She just looked at me. She couldn't say anything. So then a little light turned on. Click. I saw the devil in the details. Just as clear as I'm looking into this camera. I said, "Oh, I get it now." And I turned to look at him sitting behind his desk. He was sitting there very quiet with in his typical quiet, hands folded fashion, looking very proper, looking very much like a preacher. I said, "Oh, I get it now. I see. I saw the devil in the details." I said, "Now I get it." I said, "Hey, you," pointing to the stepdad. I said, "Remember all those stories you told of the guy in the pulpit about how much faith you and my mother had evangelizing down through the South, getting those meager offerings, $1 here, $1.50, $2, $2.50, but you lived by faith?" I looked right at him. He dropped his head. He wouldn't even look at me. I said, "You're a liar. You are a liar." I said, "You lived off of the money that was in my trust fund." Now, how much that was, I don't know. I never did find out how much that was or would have been. Had it been put in a trust fund for 18 years. I don't know. I've never actually went back and researched how much that money would have, how much it would have been. I said, "You didn't live off of those little meager offerings. You lived off of my trust fund." My mother sat back down on the couch just staring at me, glaring at me. And he just sat behind his desk, dropped his head. I said, "You're both liars." Stood behind the pulpit all these years. And of course, that's not the only lies he told. My God. He told lie after lie after lie. Once I began to see them for what they were, I said, "Oh yeah, use my money out of my trust fund and told the sad story of how you had to live by faith. You get it now? The devil in the details. You see why it's important? That was his voice behind the pulpit. See, another voice. It wasn't God's voice. And yet at the same time, I saw people actually healed, miracles take place under his ministry. But he was a liar. He was a deceiver. No different than Judas. The scripture says that Jesus, Yeshua, knew that he was a devil from the beginning. However, when he sent the disciples out, and Judas was right in the midst, he said, go out, heal the sick, raise the dead, cast out devils. Freely you have received, freely give. Judas was right there. He was the devil. Because gifts and callings without repentance. The disciples were already gifted before Acts 2. Lucifer is gifted, very gifted and very anointed. Now, can he heal? No. Only God can heal, but he's gifted. The devil in the details. Can you see it now? I was going to continue on and tell you what happened after that, but we'll save that for the next video. So anyway, God bless. Remain faithful to the truth, the love, and the peace of Yeshua.